Hey guys, welcome back. After our last video, we're going to be looking at render elements, what they can be used for, and more specifically, the multi-matte render element. So to explain briefly what a render element is, when you render out your image, you get this, as you can see on screen, a beauty render. However, the way the computer processes a beauty render is by making lots of different layers and building them on top of each other. In Vray, the 5 minimum amounts of layers that you require to make a beauty RGB color pass is lighting, global illumination, reflection, refraction, specular. If you don't know what those are, don't worry. We'll take a look at them going forward and I will show you what they look like and discuss what they can be used for. I'm going to include in the description below a link to Elsa's own description as to what render elements are. And I'm going to show you quickly now, just so we can go through them. So here you can see we have beauty render elements, matte render elements, geometry render elements, and utility render elements. Now, we will not be discussing utility render elements and geometry render elements today. They can be used for a lot more complicated stuff, including compositing or problem-solving tech bottlenecks. But we will briefly look at some matte render elements and the beauty render elements. Just to go in quickly and show you, a full V-Ray beauty render would usually use a lighting layer, a global illumination layer, a reflection layer, a refraction layer, specular layer, as I mentioned before, but it also used something called SSS2, self-illumination, caustics, atmosphere, and a background. We will be using the first 5 layers mentioned, as well as the background layer during this. But as you can see, all those layers would then come together and look like a nice T shot. As for matte render elements, there are 2 which we will be using, Material ID and Multi-Matte. Both of these are useful for when you take your render elements and you put them into Photoshop to tune your image later. So, let's look how we add these render elements first. Let's close our current render. And we're going to open up our render settings. So you can either click this teapot up the top, or you can press F10 to bring these up. Now we're using V-Ray 6. Nothing here has changed since the latest update. So we're going to go straight to the Render Elements tab. And we're going to add the button click the button which says Add. Now you're going to see a lot of things here. It is very overwhelming. Do not panic. We are looking for a certain set straight away. So we know the first 5, in fact, first 6 elements that we're going to use. We want a V-Ray background, so I'm going to click on the V-Ray background. We know we want V-Ray global illumination, so I'm going to hold Control and I'm going to click on global illumination, so it selects both of them. Also know we want V-Ray lighting, so if we scroll down, as it is quite far down, these are a little hard to find. You want to avoid the raw V-Ray raw elements. Now you want, where is it? It's higher. V-Ray lighting, sorry, it's straight under global illumination. You want V-Ray reflection. These are all in alphabetical order. Reflection. We want refraction. And finally, we want specular. Okay. Let's press OK after control clicking on all of those. And you should now see V-Ray background, global illumination, lighting, reflection, refraction, specular all on the list. Now, it does say enabled off. Ignore that. The way V-Ray decides to display it, thanks to V-Ray VFB, means that they appear disabled. However, when you run them, they will render and they will appear. Now, every single one of these has their own settings you can play with, including denoisers and multipliers. You can multiply the light levels, for instance, and the color levels. We're not going to play with any of that on these ones. So I'm going to just show you what they do. We're going to hit a quick render. This might take a little longer because you're now rendering out several different elements. So as you can see, we still have our RGB color beauty image. Nothing looks out of place here. And we still have our standard alpha layer. which you normally wouldn't have to worry about anyway. Now we also have Vray background. Now this is just rendering out purely the background. In Photoshop, this is useful because it allows us to just take this and create a mask, allowing for us to insert the building in this case, or any CG object that you want into a scene, without taking any of the other elements from the render. Then you can use, we look at global illumination. So you can see where the lighting is illuminating certain parts of the building, which allows you to play with the highlights and shadows of your images. Then we have lighting. This is just the flat lighting. As you can see, the building shows up really nicely here. Then you have reflection. So any kind of reflections coming from some of your glassy materials. Unfortunately, there's not much to see. There is a little bit around here, around the door, because I have some very basic materials on right now. Refraction, which we don't see any at all. This would be light that's been scattered off of objects. In this particular case, we don't have any, but most of your renders should. And specular. This is just a flat pass of all your highlights. So anything that would have highlights on it, or a slightly different color from their base color, should all show up here. So with these elements shown off, I am going to close this render for now, because there's a couple more render elements that we need, which are very, very useful. And for now, I need to turn off the render setup menu. So let's just say that I've used a lot of different walls and a lot of different textures to make these walls. And I wanted, in Photoshop, to change all the colors of the walls without going into 3ds, without changing the materials, and without re-rendering out a whole set of new images, which in some cases can take hours. Well, let's show you how to do that, or at least prepare for that in Photoshop. When you open up your material editor, you'll see here we have in my case, several multi-map object, or multi-sub-object menus. In this case, I have them for the doors, the windows, and then the main building. Now, we can assign an ID to each of these multi-sub-object menus. So, if I wanted to select the entire building, for instance, so the walls and the roof, I'm going to select their multi-sub-object, and you see this circle, oh, it's not circle, 0 here. You click on this, you can assign it an ID channel. Now, because we're only going to use one multi-map element, we're only going to play with the channels 1, 2, and 3. So I'm going to assign this sub-object to ID channel 1. So all of these materials now will have this ID in the render element. You'll see why this is important later, but this is a very important step. So I'm going to assign the windows to channel 2. And I'm going to assign the door to channel 3. Now you can have up to 15 of these. You cannot expand past ID channel 15. And these can be applied to multiple individual materials or to a full multi-sub-object like you've seen. So, closing our material editor, as that's all we needed to do was assign 3 IDs. We're going back into our render setup. So, we will add a multi-mat element. Now, on most CG comps, you're going to want multiple of these. You can rename it by clicking down here in the name box. I suggest that you do that for every multi-mat you include. So, what does this do? Well, we can assign 3 separate material IDs here, and we can have them export onto red, green, and blue layers. So, the building material I have assigned to the material ID 1, and we have assigned the material ID of 1 to the red buffer. Firstly, we have done the same with 2 and 3 to the green and blue buffers, respectively. Now all we have to do is check the box which says is mat ID. If you're using multiple sets of material IDs all the way up to 15, you can change the material IDs here. So for instance, I could change this 1 to 4, and any material ID 4, anything using material ID 4 would display as red in this pass. I'm keeping it to 1 because we only have 3 materials for now. So I'm going to now render a new layer. You can see we're generating our image. Right now we're still on the specular paths. Going to look a little weird, but here's our multi-matte element. Here you can see we have red, green, and blue parts of our buildings. Now, why is this important? Well, in Photoshop, we can grab any one of these colors and generate a selection area or mask out of them. So if I wanted to make a change to all the windows, now my reflection layer might have reflections from the doors, it might have reflections from, say, a lamp. Or if I had something like a transparency layer, I might have something like water messing with it. This allows me to just change one specific part of the building by just selecting colors. This is really, really useful when you want to make small tweaks, or even in some cases, completely retexture things in Photoshop. Now, you can create far more complicated setups, but you can only ever have red, green, and blue at any one time on a multi-matte element. One more element to show you. Vray material ID. You can add it to the stack. As you can see, there's not many settings to play with. There is this one drop down, which it can be useful, however. I'm going to show you a quick render with it. Now, as you can see, this does not look very different to the multi-matte element render that we've done so far. What Material ID does is it will assign a color based off of a object's material ID, so that you can select specific material IDs within a scene. And the main setting with this is integer, no anti-aliasing, and color with anti-aliasing. So right now we did an integer with no AA, and we're going to now render with color with AA. And you can see the difference almost immediately. With this, it's based off of the edges of objects and materials. So these windows, for instance, show the best case of separation within the object between all its different material IDs. Now, more complex models will show a lot more colors, and fingers crossed for you, you won't end up having a lot of overlapping colors or very similar colors all next to each other. But within more complex models, that can be the case. So it's not always the most effective layer to work with, and which is why you may want to pair it with multi-matte layers. Finally, I'll show you how to export all of these. What you're going to do is click File at the top. I'm going to save all image channels to separate files. Now I made a folder ahead of time called Elements, and all I'm going to do is select. In this case, I'm going to select JPEG, but there is also a file type known as EXR and a few others which are useful depending on which softwares you're using. EXRs combine all these images into one big file, for instance, and are very useful for putting them into softwares like Nuke. However, because we're using Photoshop, it'd be easier to just upload them as a bunch of JPEGs. So I'm just going to render that out. And I'm going to grab my folder. Here are our render elements. As you can see, we have our alpha, multi-matte material, our beauty paths, background, global illumination, lighting, material ID, reflections, refractions, and specular. When I have another chance, I'll show you guys how to put this all into Photoshop and how to basically use some of these materials, or not these materials, these render elements, sorry, how to make use of them at a basic level within Photoshop, i.e. masking and tuning layers. Anyway, I hope that was a help, and thank you for watching. I shall see you in the next video.